It began with a blip on Soviet radar, an object racing above 80,000 feet, faster than any interceptor could reach. MiG-25 pilots scrambled at full power, risking engines and lives, but the distance only grew wider. Why did flawless execution and raw speed still leave them helpless? The answer rewrites what you think you know about the limits of pursuit and the supremacy of the Blackbird. A Soviet radar operator stared at the circular scope as a narrow, relentless line streaked across the glass. Unlike the lumbering pulses of a bomber or the erratic flicker of a fighter, this trace was flat and steady, moving at a velocity that defied every known profile. The P-14 Tall King early warning radar registered the target at more than 25 kilometers altitude, its return refusing to fade as it pierced the screen from horizon to horizon. The numbers told their own story. Ground speed exceeded 3,000 kilometers per hour and altitude was well above 80,000 feet. Operators had seen high-flying threats before, but nothing sustained this kind of speed. Within seconds, command centers flagged the contact as an American reconnaissance aircraft, not a bomber. Alert codes flashed. The operator's voice cut through the control room, calling in the high-speed intruder. In PVO Doctrine, a Mach 3 track at this altitude meant only one thing: priority intercept. The order moved up the chain without hesitation. MiG-25 units received the Scramble code. There was no time for debate or speculation, just the raw numbers on the scope, the certainty of an American spy plane in Soviet airspace, and the knowledge that every second counted. The Foxbat crews prepared to launch, knowing the window for action was already closing. On the ramp, the MiG-25 crews moved with urgency, each step dictated by the voice of ground control. There was no room for hesitation. The intercept order meant a combat scramble, takeoff with only enough fuel for a single high-speed climb and a brief engagement. The checklist was short: canopy sealed, throttles set, afterburners primed, the cockpit filled with the metallic click of switches and the rising whine of turbines. Engines roared to maximum thrust, shaking the airframe as the pilots braced for acceleration. Soviet Doctrine demanded a sprint, not a patrol. Every Foxbat left the ground as light as possible, carrying just enough fuel to reach the target altitude and make one pass. The logic was simple. The lighter the jet, the faster it could climb. Full afterburner was not a suggestion, it was a requirement. Controllers on the radio issued clipped instructions: heading, altitude, speed. Pilots acknowledged with a single word and pulled back the stick. There was no discretion. The intercept profile was fixed by command: climb at full power, hold nothing in reserve, trust the ground to guide the intercept. In the cockpit, the pilot's world narrowed to instruments and the relentless voice in his headset. Each second on afterburner drained the tanks, but there was no other way to reach the stratosphere before the intruder vanished. The Foxbat launched into the sky, engines howling, chasing a fleeting chance at interception under orders that allowed no margin for error. At the edge of the runway, the MiG-25's turbines reached a deafening pitch. As the throttles were shoved to maximum, afterburners ignited with a hard jolt, sending the Foxbat surging forward. The moment the wheels left the ground, the climb began. No gentle ascent, but a steep, aggressive push straight toward the upper atmosphere. The vertical speed indicator snapped upward, showing rates that few pilots ever saw: 200 meters per second, nearly 40,000 feet every minute. Fuel gauges started dropping almost as quickly as the altimeter climbed. In just a handful of minutes, a third of the onboard fuel was gone, spent in the raw effort to claw through the dense lower air. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's eyes flicked from the artificial horizon to the exhaust gas temperature gauge. Red warning lines edged closer with every second of sustained afterburner. Engine temperatures soared, climbing toward limits that engineers warned could not be crossed without risking catastrophic damage. Every dial and needle became a countdown: Fuel, temperature, altitude, all racing each other to the edge. The airframe shuddered as the jet punched through the transonic barrier, then pressed on through Mach 2. The climb rate began to fall as the air thinned and the engine struggled for oxygen. Still, the orders from ground control were clear: maintain full power, keep climbing, hold nothing back. In this regime, every second counted, but every second also burned away the margin for return. The MiG-25 was never meant to linger near its ceiling. The entire Intercept profile was a sprint against physics, with the pilot riding the fine line between maximum performance and mechanical failure. The higher the Foxbat climbed, the narrower that line became. At Mach 3 and above, the SR-71 entered an environment few aircraft could even approach. Where the MiG-25 strained to survive, the Blackbird was built to thrive. Its titanium skin, covering nearly 90% of the airframe, was chosen not for strength alone, but for the ability to endure temperatures that would soften aluminum into putty. In cruise, the leading edges routinely reached over 450 degrees Celsius. Expansion joints in the panels sealed only when the aircraft was hot, and the JP-7 fuel doubled as a heat sink, flowing through heat exchangers to cool vital systems before burning in the engines. The heart of the Blackbird's performance was the Pratt & Whitney J58 engine. Unlike any other operational engine, the J58 could run in a unique bypass mode, shifting much of the incoming air around the turbojet core straight into the afterburner. At Mach 3.2, as much as 80% of the thrust came not from the engine itself, but from the controlled shockwaves at the intake. The engine's variable spike inlets, each moving up to 66 centimeters, trapped and tamed supersonic air, slowing it for combustion while maximizing pressure recovery. The spikes and bleed doors automatically adjusted with speed, keeping the airflow stable and the engine safe from unstarts, the sudden violent loss of inlet control that could cripple performance. Inside the cockpit, SR-71 crews watched the needles settle into their cruise positions. One pilot later described it this way: the airplane felt most comfortable at Mach 3.2. That's where everything smoothed out. For the Blackbird, the edge of the atmosphere was not a barrier, but home turf. The aircraft's systems, structure, and fuel were tuned to a regime that forced every other interceptor to the edge of destruction. Where the MiG-25 sprint ended in warning lights, the SR-71's run was just beginning. Ground controllers worked the intercept math in real time, plotting vectors and closure rates as the Foxbat climbed. The lines on their charts told a blunt truth. Even as the MiG-25 surged upward at full power, the SR-71 was already moving away at over 3,000 kilometers per hour, holding altitude above 80,000 feet. The intercept corridor, the brief window where the two paths might cross, shrank with every second. At best, the MiG-25 had less than 3 minutes to reach an altitude where a shot was possible, and the Blackbird's velocity meant that window closed almost as soon as it opened. Slant range figures showed the gap widening, not shrinking. Relative velocity vectors, calculated by hand and hurried over radios, confirmed the outcome. The SR-71 was never standing still, never waiting to be caught. The geometry was relentless, and no amount of pilot skill could change the math. Missiles offered no solution. At 80,000 feet, the air was so thin that a launched R-40 lost nearly half its energy just climbing to the Blackbird's altitude. Even at Mach 4, the missile's margin over the SR-71 was measured in seconds and in meters per second, not in miles or minutes. The seeker required a lock that simply did not last. By the time the missile acquired the target, it was already racing out of range. In the cockpit, pilots listened to the guidance tone fade, and they knew the math was against them. Not a single SR-71 was ever brought down by a Foxbat or its weapons. For the engineers, the numbers were final. For the pilots, the realization came in silence, high above the clouds, as the Blackbird vanished from their scopes. Even as technology advances, the laws of physics still decide the limits of pursuit and defense. Supersonic ambition meets an unbreakable boundary, and that boundary shapes every new design today. The gap between possible and impossible endures, no matter the pilot's courage. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts below.